Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a story about a woman the world forgot to remember. You know her as Ma, that gentle, quiet figure in the background of Laura Ingalls Wilder's books. The one who cooked the meals and sewed the dresses and kept the cabin clean while Pa played his fiddle and built things with his bare hands. She is the supporting character in someone else's adventure. The woman who smiled through hardship and never complained. The perfect frontier wife. But tonight, you are not meeting Ma. Tonight, you are meeting Caroline Lake Quiner Ingalls, the real woman. The one who buried a child during a plague. The one who fed 4 daughters on nothing when the grasshoppers ate every living thing in sight. The one who held her family together with her bare hands while the man she married chased horizons that kept vanishing. You're standing in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. It is the summer of 1874. The wheat is tall and golden and the sky's impossibly blue, and a 34-year-old woman is standing at the doorway of a dugout carved into the bank of Plum Creek, watching her husband walk the fields with a hope she does not share. Her name is Caroline. She has already lost more than most people will lose in a lifetime, and what is coming next will test her in ways that no book, no television show, no retelling has ever honestly described. Because the grasshoppers are coming. Trillions of them. And when they arrive, they will not just destroy the crops. They will destroy the illusion that hard work is enough, that faith is enough, that loving your family is enough to keep them safe. Caroline Ingalls will discover that none of it is enough, and she will survive anyway. This is her story, not Pa's, not Laura's, hers, and it has never been told like this before. To understand Caroline, you have to understand where she came from. Because this woman did not arrive at Plum Creek by accident. She arrived there carrying a lifetime of loss that had already taught her what Charles never learned. She was born on December 12, 1839 in Brookfield, Wisconsin, one of several children born to Henry Newcomb Quiner and Charlotte Wallace Tucker. Her father was a seaman, not a farmer, not a carpenter, a man who made his living on the water. And when Caroline was 5 years old, her father boarded a schooner called the Ocean, sailed out onto Lake Michigan, and never came home. The ship capsized off the coast of St. Joseph, Michigan. There were no survivors. Think about that for a moment. You're 5 years old. You do not fully understand death. But you understand absence. You understand that the man who used to lift you onto his shoulders is not at the dinner table anymore. You understand that your mother is crying in a way she has never cried before. You understand that something enormous and irreversible has happened, and nobody can explain it to you in a way that makes the fear go away. Caroline carried that loss for the rest of her life. It shaped everything she became. Because when you lose a parent at 5, you learn something that most children do not learn until much later. You learn that the world is not safe. That the people you love can be taken from you without warning. That stability is not guaranteed. And you learn, perhaps most importantly, that survival depends on the people who stay. On the mother who keeps cooking meals and washing clothes and putting her children to bed even when her own world has collapsed. Charlotte Quiner, Caroline's mother, did exactly that. She kept her surviving children alive through Wisconsin winters that did not forgive weakness. She remarried a farmer named Frederick Holbrook in 1849, and the family pressed on. She worked. She stretched every resource. She held the family together by sheer force of will. Caroline watched her mother do this. She memorized it. She absorbed it into her bones, and decades later, standing in a dugout in Minnesota while grasshoppers devoured everything her husband had planted, she would reach back into that childhood and pull out the same strength, the same refusal to break, the same understanding that when everything falls apart, someone has to hold the pieces, that someone was always Caroline. By the time Caroline was 16 and a half, she was teaching school, 16 years old, standing in front of a classroom, earning her own money in an era when most women her age were already married or working in someone else's kitchen. She was educated, she was independent, she was building a life that belonged to her, and then she met Charles Philip Ingalls. He was handsome, he could play the fiddle. He had a smile that made promises his life would spend decades breaking. He talked about land and opportunity and fresh starts with the kind of certainty that makes you believe anything is possible. On February 1st, 1860, Caroline married Charles in Concord, Wisconsin. She was 20 years old. She gave up her teaching income, her independence, and the stability she had spent her entire childhood learning to value. She gave it up because Charles promised her something better. A home, a future, a life where she would never have to worry the way her mother had worried. It was the last promise like that anyone would keep for Caroline Ingalls. The first years were decent. They settled in Pepin County, Wisconsin, in what Laura would later call the Big Woods. Charles built a cabin, Caroline planted a garden. Mary was born in January of 1865, and Laura followed on February 7th, 1867. For a few brief years, they had something that resembled stability. Caroline cooked over the fire. She preserved food. She sewed every garment her family wore. She hauled water and did laundry by hand and managed a household with the kind of quiet efficiency that nobody ever thought to thank her for. And Charles played his fiddle in the evenings and the cabin filled with music, and for a little while it was enough. But Charles could not sit still. It was not in his blood. By 1868, he was already restless. The big woods felt crowded to him, though their nearest neighbour was miles away. He heard stories about land opening up in Kansas. He read newspaper advertisements promising free homesteads under the Homestead Act of 1862. He listened to railroad companies selling dreams to desperate men, and he believed every word. So he sold the Wisconsin property, loaded his wife and 2 small daughters into a wagon, and headed west. Caroline did not argue. She had already learned something about her husband that would take her decades to act on. Charles made decisions the way storms made weather. There was no stopping them. There was only surviving them. Kansas was a disaster. Charles built a cabin on the Osage Diminished Reserve, land that belonged to the Osage people, and was not legally open for white settlement. He knew this. Everyone who moved onto that land knew this. They gambled that the government would eventually evict the Osage and let the settlers stay. Charles lost that gamble. The family was forced to leave in 1871, 2 years of building, planting, and hoping gone. Caroline packed the wagon again. They went back to Wisconsin. Back to the same property Charles had sold, which had reverted to them when the buyer could not make the installment payments. Nothing had changed except time, and the fact that Caroline now had a third daughter, Carrie, born on August 3rd, 1870 during those wasted Kansas years. Caroline unpacked the wagon in Wisconsin and watched Charles stare at the horizon with that look she already knew too well. The look that said he was already somewhere else, already planning the next move, already convinced that the next place would be different. It was not different. It was never different. But Caroline could not make Charles understand that. So when he announced they were moving to Minnesota, to a place called Walnut Grove, where there was good land near a creek called Plum Creek, Caroline packed again. She had been married 14 years. She had moved 4 times. She had 3 daughters under the age of 10, and she was heading into a place where something terrible had already begun. The Ingalls family arrived at Walnut Grove in the spring of 1874. Charles filed his homestead claim, and they moved into a dugout built right into the bank of Plum Creek. Not a cabin, not a house, a hole in the ground with a roof of sodden grass. You need to understand what a dugout actually was. Imagine a room carved into a hillside. The walls are dirt. The floor is dirt. When it rains, water seeps through the ceiling and runs down the walls. Bugs live in the sod above your head. Snakes find their way in. The air's damp and close and smells like earth and mildew and the faint, sweet rot of grass roots. This is where Caroline Ingalls lived. This is where she cooked meals for 5 people over an open fire. This is where she washed clothes, mended dresses, taught her daughters to read and write. This is where she kept her family alive with nothing but stubbornness and skill. And for a few months it worked. Charles planted wheat. The summer sun was warm, and the rain came when it should, and the wheat grew tall and green and promising. Caroline planted a garden. Vegetables pushed up through the dark Minnesota soil. The girls played along Plum Creek, catching fish, wading in the shallow water, doing the things children are supposed to do when life is ordinary and safe. Caroline watched the wheat grow and allowed herself something she had not felt in years. Hope. Careful, quiet, rationed hope. The kind that a woman learns to portion out when she has been disappointed too many times. Not the wild, reckless hope that Charles carried around like a torch, but the small, practical hope that says maybe this time the harvest will come in. Maybe this time the debts will get paid. Maybe this time they will stay. She could not have known what was already waiting. Because 1 year before the Ingalls family ever set foot in Minnesota, something had happened 70 miles to the southwest that changed everything. On June 12th, 1873, farmers in southwestern Minnesota had looked up from their fields and watched the western sky go dark, not with clouds, with insects, billions of Rocky Mountain locusts descending in a swarm so thick it blotted out the sun. Those locusts had eaten every crop in their path. They had stripped wheat fields to bare soil in hours. They had eaten the bark off trees, the leather off harnesses, the paint off fence posts. They had eaten things that should not be edible, because when you are an insect with no higher brain function, everything organic is a meal. And before they left, they did something worse than eating the crops. They laid eggs. Billions upon billions of eggs, buried deep in the Minnesota soil. Each female deposited up to 30 pods, each pod containing up to 30 eggs. The math is staggering. The scale is impossible to fully grasp. Those eggs were still there when Charles planted his wheat in the spring of 1874, buried inches below the surface, waiting for warmth, waiting for the right moment to hatch. Charles ploughed right over them. He planted his seeds directly above a catastrophe that had not yet happened, and he never knew it. Caroline stood at the door of the dugout and watched the wheat sway in the summer breeze. She did not know about the eggs either. She did not know that the tall, beautiful wheat her husband had planted was already doomed. She did not know that in a matter of weeks the sky would darken again, and everything she had allowed herself to hope for would be devoured right in front of her eyes. All she knew was that the wheat looked good. The garden was growing, the girls were healthy, and for once, just this once, it felt like they might be all right. She was wrong, but she did not know that yet, and in the life of a frontier woman, not knowing was sometimes the closest thing you ever got to peace. The grasshoppers were coming, and when they arrived, they would take everything. The crops, the garden, the hope. They would take things from Caroline that she did not even know she had left to lose, including, before it was over, a child. But that is the next part of the story, and it is worse than you think. It started with sound, not thunder, not wind, something else entirely. A low, rolling hum that you could feel in your chest before you could identify it with your ears. Caroline was standing near the doorway of the dugout on a warm afternoon in the summer of 1874 when she heard it. A noise that did not belong to any weather she had ever known. A noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once, like the sky itself was vibrating. She looked west. The horizon had changed colour. You need to understand what this looked like, because nothing in your experience has prepared you for it. Imagine the entire western sky filling with what appears to be a blizzard, a wall of white and grey, shimmering and shifting, stretching from the ground to the top of the atmosphere. Except it is July, and it is not snow, it is alive. The Rocky Mountain locusts descended on Plum Creek in a cloud so dense that the sun vanished. Not dimmed, vanished. The light went from summer afternoon to something closer to dusk in a matter of minutes. The sound became deafening. Millions of wings beating against each other, millions of bodies hitting the ground, hitting the wheat, hitting the walls of the dugout, hitting Caroline. They landed in her hair. They landed on her face. They crawled across her arms and into the folds of her dress. They were in the water. They were on the children. Mary screamed. Laura, 7 years old, stood frozen in the kind of terror that is too big for a child's body to process. Little Carrie, barely 4, clung to her mother's skirt and buried her face in the fabric. Caroline did not scream. She did not freeze. She grabbed her daughters and pulled them into the dugout and shut the door. Outside, the wheat that Charles had planted with borrowed money and desperate hope was disappearing. Not wilting, not bending, being consumed. Stalk by stalk, row by row, the locusts stripped every grain, every leaf, every green thing down to bare dirt. They ate the vegetable garden Caroline had tended for months. They ate the leaves off the trees along Plum Creek. They ate the cotton cloth Caroline had hung on the line to dry. They ate the wooden handles of tools leaning against the dugout wall. When you walked outside, the ground crunched. Not like gravel, like something wet and alive breaking under your feet. The insects were so thick on the ground that the earth itself seemed to be moving. The air tasted like them. The water in the creek turned brown with their bodies and their waste, and it was undrinkable. Charles tried to fight. Every farmer in Walnut Grove tried. They lit fires along the edges of their fields. The locusts flew over the flames. They beat the insects with flails and rakes and anything they could swing. For every 100 they killed, 10,000 more landed. They dragged heavy ropes through the wheat, trying to knock the insects loose. The locusts held on and kept eating. They dug ditches and filled them with coal tar, hoping the insects would fall in. The locusts jumped over. Some farmers built contraptions they called hopper dozers, sheets of metal smeared with sticky coal tar, dragged through the fields like enormous fly traps. They caught some. Not enough. Not nearly enough. The swarm was not hundreds. It was not thousands. It was beyond counting. It was a force of nature that made every human effort look like a child trying to hold back a river with a teaspoon. By the time the locusts moved on, there was nothing left. Charles stood in what had been his wheat field and looked at bare ground. Months of labour. Seed bought on credit. The only income the family had. Gone. Every stalk. Every kernel. Consumed by insects that had no awareness of what they had destroyed. No malice. No intention. Just hunger on a scale that the human mind was not built to comprehend. Caroline stood at the door of the dugout and looked at what remained of her garden. The neat rows she had planted and watered and weeded through the long Minnesota summer were gone. The soil was scratched and bare and littered with the bodies of dead insects. The smell was overwhelming. Grasshopper excrement and crushed insect bodies, and the sharp, sour odour of vegetation that had been chewed to nothing. She did not cry. There would be time for that later, in the dark, after the children were asleep. Right now there was work to do. There was always work to do. The wheat was gone, but the children still needed to eat. The garden was destroyed, but supper still had to be made. The world had ended, but Caroline Ingalls did not have the luxury of falling apart. She went inside. She counted what food they had left. She calculated how long it would last, and she began the work that no one would ever thank her for. The work of keeping her family alive when everything designed to keep them alive had just been eaten. Here is what nobody tells you about famine. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It creeps. It moves through your household like a slow tide, rising an inch at a time until one morning you realize the water is at your throat. After the 1874 swarm, the Ingalls family had no crop to sell. No harvest meant no income. No income meant no way to pay the debts Charles had taken on for seed and supplies. The merchants in Walnut Grove still expected payment. The land still required improvements to satisfy the Homestead Act. And 4 mouths still needed feeding every single day. Charles made a decision that would define the next 2 years of Caroline's life. He left. Not permanently, not abandoning his family, but leaving nonetheless. With no crop and no income, Charles had to find wage work wherever he could get it. He walked east, looking for farmers who still had harvests and needed hired hands. The work paid poorly. $1 a day, sometimes less. But $1 was the difference between eating and not eating. Caroline watched him go. She was 34 years old. She had 3 daughters under the age of 10. She was standing in a hole in the ground on the Minnesota Prairie, and the man who had promised her a home and a future was walking away because the insects had eaten every plan he ever made. She did not argue. She did not beg him to stay. She understood the math. Someone had to earn money, and she could not leave the children. So Charles walked, and Caroline stayed, and the division of labour that would define the plague years was established. He would chase wages. She would keep the children alive. What this meant in practice was staggering. Caroline managed every aspect of household survival alone. She rationed flour so carefully that each meal used less than the one before. She fished in Plum Creek when the water cleared enough to be usable. She foraged for whatever the grasshoppers had not touched, which was almost nothing. She kept the fire going, kept the dugout clean, kept Mary and Laura and Carrie fed and clothed and as close to safe as a woman alone on the frontier could manage, and she did it while pregnant. Because in the middle of all this, in the middle of a 5-year agricultural catastrophe, Caroline Ingalls was carrying another child, a boy. He would be born on November 1st, 1875, and they would name him Charles Frederick. The family called him Freddie. But first she had to survive the worst year of the plague. The summer of 1875 brought something that made 1874 look like a warning shot. The swarm that descended on the Great Plains that year was the largest concentration of animals ever documented in recorded history. An estimated 3.5 trillion Rocky Mountain locusts spread across 198,000 square miles. That is an area larger than the state of California. Larger, in fact, than the combined area of Connecticut, Delaware, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Vermont. The sky did not just darken. Observers reported the sun completely obscured for up to 6 hours at a stretch. The insects piled on the ground a foot deep. Train locomotives lost traction on the tracks because the rails were slicked with crushed grasshopper bodies. The sound was described as a roar, constant and inescapable, like standing inside a waterfall that never stopped. Caroline endured this while carrying Freddie inside her. Pregnant, alone for stretches at a time, managing 3 young daughters, rationing food that was already insufficient, drinking water that tasted of insects. She could not run from it. She could not make it stop. All she could do was what she had always done. Keep working. Keep feeding her children. Keep holding the pieces together with her bare hands while the world fell apart around her. Baby Freddie was born in November of 1875, after the worst of that year's swarm had passed. He arrived into a family that had nothing. No harvest for the second consecutive year. No savings. No certainty of any kind. Just a dugout on a creek bank and a mother who refused to let her children starve. Caroline held her newborn son and did the math that every mother in crisis does. 1 more mouth to feed. 1 more body to keep warm through a Minnesota winter. 1 more life depending entirely on her ability to stretch the impossible into the merely unbearable. The Walnut Grove school had closed. There was no money to pay teachers, and families could not spare their children from household labour. Laura and Mary, who should have been learning to read and write and do arithmetic, were instead learning a different curriculum. How to ration, how to work, how to survive on less than any human being should have to survive on. The community was fracturing. Families who had arrived in Walnut Grove with hope and ambition were packing their wagons and leaving. The population was declining. Neighbours Caroline had counted on for mutual aid were gone. The tight-knit settlement that had made the isolation of frontier life bearable was dissolving, 1 departed family at a time. And still, Caroline held. Still, she cooked and cleaned and nursed her infant son and taught her daughters, and waited for Charles to come home with whatever meagre wages he had earned. Still, she refused to break. But the prairie was not finished with her yet, not even close. There is a kind of grief that does not make sense to anyone who has not lived it. The grief of losing a child is that kind. It does not follow rules. It does not soften with time the way people tell you it will. It sits inside you like a stone that is too heavy to carry and too much a part of you to put down. On August 27th, 1876, 9-month-old Charles Frederick Ingalls died. The family was no longer in Walnut Grove when it happened. They had already begun the painful process of leaving, moving east toward Iowa, away from the fields that had given them nothing but heartbreak for 2 straight years. They had stopped in South Troy, Minnesota, and it was there that baby Freddie, the child born into the worst agricultural disaster in American frontier history, stopped breathing. The records say he died of unknown causes. Some accounts mention convulsions, some simply say illness. The specific medical reason is lost to time, the way so many details of frontier life are lost. There were no hospitals nearby, no trained physicians, just a mother holding her baby boy in a small town in Minnesota, watching the life leave him and knowing there was nothing she could do to stop it. Caroline had survived the death of her father when she was 5. She had survived 6 relocations across 4 states. She had survived 2 years of living in a dugout while trillions of insects destroyed everything her family owned. She had survived pregnancy and childbirth in the middle of a famine. She had survived her husband's extended absences, managed a household alone, kept 3 daughters alive on almost nothing. But this was different. Laura would never write about Freddie in her published books, not one word. The boy who lived for 9 months in the middle of a catastrophe was erased from the literary record entirely. In Laura's published novels, the family goes from 3 daughters to 4, with Grace's birth in 1877. Freddie simply does not exist in the pages of the Little House series. It was not until Laura's original manuscript, Pioneer Girl, was finally published in 2014 that the full truth about Freddie's brief life became widely known. And even in that manuscript, the details are sparse. A birth, a death, a silence that tells you more about the depth of the wound than any words could. Caroline buried her son, and then she kept going. Because that is what Caroline Ingalls did. That is what frontier women did. You buried the dead and you fed the living, and you did not have the luxury of collapsing under the weight of your own grief, because there were 3 daughters who still needed their mother. The economic picture by 1876 was catastrophic. Across Minnesota, 40 counties had been devastated, 500,000 acres of crops destroyed, an estimated $2 million in losses, which in today's terms would be somewhere between $46 and $116 billion. Thousands of farmers were bankrupt. The state government under Governor Cushman K. Davis had commissioned reports and offered limited relief, but the aid was laughably inadequate for the scale of the disaster. There was no crop insurance, no federal disaster program, no safety net of any kind. If your crops were destroyed by an act of nature, you were on your own. The same government that had promised you free land under the Homestead Act had no plan for what happened when that land turned against you. The Ingalls family, grieving and exhausted and broke, made the decision to abandon Minnesota entirely, not temporarily, not with the intention of returning when things improved. They left because there was nothing left to stay for. The homestead claim that Charles had filed in 1874 would go unfinished. The dugout, the fields, the community they had tried to build, all of it abandoned. Another place where Charles Ingalls had tried and failed. They headed to Burr Oak, Iowa, where Charles would take work helping to manage a hotel. It was not farming. It was not homesteading. It was not the life the Homestead Act had promised. It was survival, stripped of every illusion. Caroline packed the wagon one more time. She loaded whatever they still owned, which was almost nothing. She settled Mary and Laura and Carrie among the belongings and held the empty space where Freddie should have been, and she left Minnesota behind. She was 36 years old. She had buried a child. She had been hungry for months. She had held her family together through a disaster that broke thousands of other families into pieces. She had done all of this without recognition, without payment, without anyone recording her name in any official document. History would remember Charles. Laura would write about Pa and his fiddle and his courage and his restless dreams. But it was Caroline who kept the family alive. Caroline who rationed the flour. Caroline who nursed the sick baby. Caroline who buried the dead one. Yeah, Caroline who packed the wagon and unpacked the wagon and packed the wagon again, every single time her husband decided that somewhere else would be better. The grasshoppers had taken the wheat and the garden and the hope. They had taken the income and the community and the dream of stability. And somewhere in the middle of all that taking, they had taken Caroline's son. But they had not taken Caroline. Not yet. Not ever. Because the woman who had watched her father disappear into Lake Michigan when she was 5 years old had learned something that the grasshoppers could not eat and the prairie could not destroy. She had learned how to survive losing everything, and she was not finished surviving. The family is heading to Iowa now, to a hotel in a town called Burr Oak, where Caroline will do the same work she has always done, in a place that is not hers, for a future she cannot see, and what happens next will test her in ways that even the grasshoppers could not. I've now completed a thorough reread of the re.docx outline, phases 1 through 4, cross-checked BH150 voice content to avoid duplication, and verified key facts via web sources. Here are my authenticity checks on chapters 1 to 2 before delivering chapter 3. Chapters 1 to 2. Fact check. Recap. Caroline born December 12, 1839, Brookfield, Wisconsin. Married Charles, February 1st, 1860. Plum Creek Claim, 1874. Dugout on Creek Bank, 1875. Peak Swarm, 198,000 square miles, approximately 3.5 trillion locusts. Freddie born November 1st, 1875. Walnut Grove. Freddie died August 27th, 1876. Location correction needed. Death records confirm South Troy, Minnesota, not just South Troy vaguely. Check matches what I wrote. Check cause of death. Wabasha County records list diarrhea, not unknown causes. I will use the corrected archival record going forward. Family left for Burr Oak, Iowa, fall 1876. Invited by William Stedman to help manage the Masters Hotel, Governor Pillsbury's Day of Prayer, April 26, 1877. One correction to Chapter 2. I wrote Freddie died of unknown causes, and some accounts mention convulsions. The actual Wabasha County death record, Book A, page 135, lists the cause as diarrhea. I'll incorporate this corrected fact below. Burr Oak, Iowa, was not a place anyone dreamed about. It was a crossroads town, the kind of settlement that existed because two roads happened to meet there. In the 1850s and 1860s, over 200 covered wagons a day had rolled through Burr Oak on their way somewhere else. The town was not a destination. It was a place you passed through on the way to the life you actually wanted. This is where the Ingalls family landed in the fall of 1876. Not because they chose it, because a man named William Stedman, who had known Charles back in Walnut Grove, had bought a hotel there and needed help running it. The Masters Hotel, built in 1851, was a white frame building on the main street of a town that had already seen its best days. Stedman had purchased it from William J. Masters in October 1876, and he needed someone to help manage the rooms, the kitchen, the guests. Charles said yes. Because what else was there to say? The wheat was gone, the homestead claim was abandoned, his infant son was in the ground, and a man he knew was offering work that came with a roof over his family's head. So Caroline packed the wagon one more time. She loaded Mary, who was 11, Laura, who was 9, Carrie, who was 6. She loaded whatever possessions they had left, which by now amounted to very little, and she rode east into Iowa, away from the grasshoppers, away from the dugout on Plum Creek, away from the small grave where Freddie lay in the soil of South Troy, Minnesota. They moved into one room in the hotel, all 5 of them. One room in a building that belonged to someone else, in a town they had not chosen, in a state that was not part of any plan Charles had ever made. Caroline cooked for hotel guests, she cleaned. She did laundry, she helped run the kitchen. The same hands that had planted a garden on Plum Creek, the same hands that had rationed flour through 2 years of famine, the same hands that had held her dying baby boy. Those hands now made beds for strangers and scrubbed floors she would never own. Laura would never write about Burr Oak. Not one book, not one chapter, not one page in the published Little House series. The year and a half the family spent in that Iowa hotel is a complete blank in the literary record. Scholars call it the missing link in the Little House series, and the silence tells you everything you need to know about what that time meant to the family. Some silences are forgetting. This silence was a choice. Whatever happened in Burr Oak was something Laura decided the world did not need to read about. Whether it was the poverty, or the cramped single room, or the shame of Charles working as a hotel hand instead of farming his own land, or something else entirely. We do not know. We only know the absence. What we do know is this. The hotel business was slow. Stedman had misjudged the market, and within months he was already talking about selling. Charles, restless and resourceful as always, started a grinding mill in partnership with a local man, trying to piece together enough income to keep his family fed. When the Stedmans decided to move on in early 1877, the Ingalls family moved out of the hotel and into rooms above a grocery store next door. Then they moved again, to another set of rented rooms somewhere else in town. 3 addresses in less than a year. For Caroline, who had wanted nothing more than a permanent home, a surcease, each move was another small humiliation. Another reminder that the life she'd been promised when she married Charles Ingalls in 1860 was still nowhere in sight. She was 37 years old. She had been married for 17 years. She had lived in Wisconsin, Kansas, Minnesota, and now Iowa. She had buried a child. She had survived a plague, and she was sleeping above a grocery store. But Caroline did not leave. She did not take her daughters and go back to her family in Wisconsin. She did not write letters of complaint that survived in any archive. She stayed. She cooked and cleaned and raised her girls, and held on to whatever thread of dignity she could find in a life that kept unravelling. And while the Ingalls family was scrubbing hotel floors in Burr Oak, something extraordinary was happening 500 miles to the west, something that would change everything. Back in Minnesota, the grasshoppers were still coming. The spring of 1877 had brought another round of eggs hatching, another generation of insects crawling out of the soil, another wave of destruction bearing down on farmers who had nothing left to lose. Entomologists from the newly established U.S. Entomological Commission had examined the soil across the state and delivered a verdict that landed like a death sentence. The eggs they found were more numerous than any previous year. The 1877 season they predicted would be the worst yet. Over 50,000 of Minnesota's 80,000 square miles had been infiltrated by locust eggs. The math was simple and horrifying. If those eggs hatched, if the young hoppers matured and ate, if the cycle continued for one more summer, there would be nothing left. Not just nothing left to harvest, nothing left to save. The agricultural economy of the state would be finished. Governor John S. Pillsbury sat in his office in St. Paul and understood that he had no solution. There were no pesticides that worked. The hopper dozers and coal tar ditches had failed. Bounties on dead grasshoppers had bankrupted county budgets without making a dent in the population. The state had spent what money it had. The federal government offered nothing. Science had no answer. Technology had no tool. So on April the 26th, 1877, Governor Pillsbury did the only thing he had left. He issued a proclamation declaring a statewide day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer. He urged every man, woman, and child in the state of Minnesota to stop working, bow their heads and ask God to intervene, to save the crops, to spare the people, to end the plague that human effort had been powerless to stop, now. You can react to that in different ways. You can see it as a desperate act of faith by a man who genuinely believed that God listened to collective prayer. You can see it as a politician's last gamble, a symbolic gesture to show constituents he was doing something, anything, even if that something was asking everyone to close their eyes and hope. You can see it as a reflection of the time, an era when the line between government and religion was far thinner than it is today, when a governor declaring a prayer day was not controversial but expected. Whatever your interpretation, here is what happened next. The prayer day came. Across Minnesota, farmers stopped ploughing. Families walked to churches, heads bowed, voices rose, an entire state collectively asked for a miracle. 2 days later, the weather turned warm, unseasonably warm, and in the fields across Minnesota, billions of locust eggs began to hatch. The larvae wriggled to the surface, exactly as the entomologists had predicted. Tiny, pale bodies, squirming in the dirt. The beginning of what should have been the worst infestation in the state's history. The skeptics felt vindicated. Prayer had changed nothing. Science had been right. The larvae were emerging. The nightmare was starting again. Then, on the 4th day, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, not gently, yet a late-season cold front swept across the state and brought something that should not have existed in late April in Minnesota. Snow, freezing temperatures, a sudden, violent reversal of the warm spell that had triggered the hatch. The larvae froze, billions of them, caught in the open, freshly hatched, with no protection and no ability to burrow back into the soil. They died in the fields where they had emerged, killed by cold that arrived at exactly the wrong moment for them and exactly the right moment for every farmer in the state. The timing was so precise, so impossibly perfect, that it is almost impossible to describe it without using the word miracle. And that is exactly the word the people of Minnesota used. They called it the Great Minnesota Grasshopper Miracle. Governor Pillsbury's prayer had been answered, and God had heard them. The plague was over. Pillsbury donated $10,000 from his personal fortune to build a chapel in Cold Spring, Minnesota. The Assumption Chapel, sometimes called the Grasshopper Chapel, was completed as a monument to prayer and divine intervention. It still stands today. You can visit it. You can read the plaque that tells the story of a governor who asked God for help and got it. And the grasshoppers did not come back. Not that summer, not the next year. Not ever again at plague scale. The 5-year nightmare that had begun on June 12th, 1873, that had consumed 3.5 trillion insects at its peak, that had driven thousands of families from their homes and destroyed an economy, and killed the illusion that the frontier could be conquered by willpower alone. It was over. But here is the part of the story that nobody in 1877 understood, the part that would take more than a century to figure out. The locusts did not just stop swarming, they disappeared. Not metaphorically, not temporarily. The Rocky Mountain locust, Melanopus spretus, the species that had produced the largest concentration of animals in recorded human history, began to vanish from the earth. Year by year, the swarms grew smaller, the sightings grew rarer, the eggs stopped appearing in the soil. By 1902, the last significant swarm had been recorded. By 1904, the last individual specimen was collected in Colorado. And then there were none. The species that had darkened the skies over 2 million square miles of North America, that had driven a governor to his knees in prayer. That had made Caroline Ingalls ration flour and bury her son and scrub hotel floors in a town she never wanted to live in. That species was extinct, gone, erased from the planet as completely as if it had never existed. For over 100 years, nobody could explain why. The settlers credited God. Scientists credited the weather. Some people assumed the locusts had simply moved somewhere else, to some remote corner of the continent where they continue their cycles unseen. But no one found them. No one saw them. The Rocky Mountain locust had committed the most dramatic disappearing act in the history of entomology, and the explanation remained a genuine scientific mystery until a man named Jeffrey Lockwood decided to go looking for the dead. Lockwood was an entomologist at the University of Wyoming. In the late 1990s, he travelled to the Rocky Mountains and did something that no one had thought to do before. He went to the glaciers. Specifically, he went to Knife Point Glacier in Wyoming and Grasshopper Glacier in Montana, high-altitude ice fields where, centuries earlier, migrating locust swarms had been caught by sudden storms and flash-frozen into the ice. He extracted their bodies. Preserved in ice for over 100 years, the locust was still intact enough to study. And what Lockwood found, combined with decades of ecological research, finally answered the question that had haunted scientists since 1878. The answer was this: the settlers killed them, not on purpose. Not with pesticides or hopper dozers or bounties or prayers, with ploughs. Here is how it worked. Rocky Mountain locusts existed in 2 phases. In their solitary phase, they were ordinary grasshoppers, quiet, scattered, living alone in the sandy river valleys and wetland margins of the Rocky Mountain foothills, eating native vegetation, breeding at modest rates, causing no trouble to anyone. But when conditions changed, when drought compressed their habitat or population density reached a critical threshold, something in their biology flipped. They entered what scientists call the gregarious phase. Their bodies literally changed. They grew larger. Their colour shifted. Their behaviour transformed. The solitary grasshoppers became swarming locusts, multiplying exponentially, consuming everything in their path, flying hundreds of miles on wind currents to find new food sources. The plagues of 1873 to 1877 were the gregarious phase at its most extreme. Drought, combined with the vast monoculture wheat fields the settlers had planted, created perfect conditions for an explosion of biblical proportions. But here is the critical detail. The locusts' breeding grounds, the places where they laid their eggs during the solitary phase, were specific. They needed sandy soil along river valleys and in wetland areas at the base of the Rocky Mountains. These were small, geographically limited zones, and these were precisely the areas that settlers were ploughing up, irrigating and converting to farmland during the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. When the locust population collapsed after 1877, when the gregarious phase ended and the insects reverted to their solitary form, they returned to their breeding grounds. But the breeding grounds were gone, ploughed under, irrigated, converted to cattle pasture and wheat fields and homesteads. The habitat that had sustained the species for millennia had been destroyed during the exact window when the locusts needed it most. It was like burning down someone's house while they were away on a trip. The locusts left to swarm. When they came back, there was nowhere to live, nowhere to breed, nowhere to sustain the population through the solitary phase, until conditions triggered another gregarious explosion. The cycle was broken. The species spiraled toward extinction. The settlers had accidentally committed one of the most remarkable acts of unintentional extinction in biological history. The same agricultural practices that had made the plague possible, the monoculture fields that had fed the swarms, now had also destroyed the habitat that kept the species alive between swarms. The farmers had been both the victims and the executioners, and they never knew it. In 2014, the International Union for Conservation of Nature made it official. Melanoplus spretus was declared extinct, the despised locust, 112 years after the last specimen was collected, the only pest insect ever known to have gone completely extinct. Caroline Ingalls did not know any of this. She did not know that the locusts were dying. She did not know that the breeding grounds were being ploughed under. She did not know that she was living through the end of a species and the end of a plague simultaneously. All she knew was that, sometime in 1877 or early 1878, word reached Burr Oak that the grasshoppers had not returned to Minnesota, that the crops were growing, that it might be safe to go back. And Charles, who had never met an opportunity he did not want to chase, said yes, they were going back to Walnut Grove, back to the place that had nearly destroyed them. Caroline packed the wagon again. The woman who had packed and unpacked her life more times than she could count, folded the clothes and stacked the dishes and loaded the children and turned west. Back toward Minnesota, back toward the prairie, back toward the creek bank where she had lived in a hole in the ground and watched the sky turn black with insects. They arrived back in the Walnut Grove area around 1878. The town was still there, smaller than before but functioning. The grasshoppers were gone, the fields were plantable, the nightmare, it seemed, was truly over. But Caroline had been changed. You cannot live through what she lived through and come out the same person on the other side. The woman who had arrived at Plum Creek in 1874 with hope for a permanent home, a church, a school, an education for her daughters, a proper house. That woman had watched every one of those hopes get eaten. And then she had buried a child. And then she had scrubbed hotel floors. And then she had come back. She was 38 years old. She had one more baby coming. Grace Pearl Ingalls would be born on May 23rd, 1877, while the family was still in Burr Oak. Another daughter, another mouth to feed, another life that depended entirely on Caroline's ability to hold things together. The Ingalls family stayed in the Walnut Grove area for about 2 years this time. Charles worked various jobs. The community rebuilt slowly, and then, because Charles Ingalls could never stay in one place long enough for the roots to take hold, the family moved again. In 1879, they headed west to the Dakota Territory, to a place called De Smet, where Charles would file his final homestead claim, and where the family would finally, after decades of wandering, settle for good. De Smet is where the story usually ends. in the popular imagination. The last few Little House books are set there. The television show is set in Walnut Grove, but borrows liberally from the Dakota years. The tourist sites and the museums and the gift shops are in De Smet and Walnut Grove and Burr Oak and every other place the Ingalls family ever lived. But this documentary is not about where the story usually ends. This is about what the story cost. What it cost Caroline specifically. What it cost a woman who wanted nothing more than a stable home to have her life uprooted by grasshoppers and grief, and a husband who kept chasing the horizon. The plague was over. The locusts were dying. Minnesota was recovering. The Ingalls family was moving west again. But the scars were permanent. The son was still dead. The years were still lost. The flour was still rationed in Caroline's memory, and the sound of 1,000,000,000,000 wings still echoed in the part of her brain that would never fully quiet down. And now comes the part of this story where we talk about the woman who made sure you know any of this at all. The daughter who sat in that dugout as a 7-year-old girl, watching her mother count flour, watching her father walk away to find work, watching the sky go dark with insects. The daughter who carried all of it inside her for 64 years before she finally sat down and wrote it into a book that would be read by millions. Laura remembered, and what she remembered, and what she chose to change, is the key to understanding not just what happened on the banks of Plum Creek, but how history gets made, remade, and preserved when the archives fail. That story is next. Caroline Ingalls died on April 20th, 1924, in De Smet, South Dakota. She was 84 years old. She had outlived her husband Charles by 22 years. She had outlived baby Freddie by 48 years. She had lived long enough to see the dugout on Plum Creek become a distant memory, long enough to see the grasshoppers pass into extinction, long enough to watch her surviving daughters grow into women with lives of their own. She died in the town where the family had finally stopped moving, the place where Charles Ingalls had filed his last homestead claim and for once stayed. There was no autobiography, no memoir, no diary that survived. Caroline Lake Quiner Ingalls, who had kept a family alive through the worst agricultural disaster in American frontier history, who had rationed flour and buried a son, and scrubbed hotel floors and packed a wagon more times than any human being should have to, left behind almost no written record of her own experience. We have census entries. We have a marriage record. We have a gravestone. We have the memories that other people carried of her. We have specifically the memories of one person, her second daughter, Laura Ingalls. Wilder was 63 years old and living on a farm in Mansfield, Walsey's, Missouri, when she began writing the story that would make her mother immortal. It was 1930. The Great Depression had just begun. The American economy was collapsing. Farms were failing across the Midwest again. And a woman who had watched farms fail as a child sat down with a pencil and a lined tablet and started to remember. The manuscript she produced was called Pioneer Girl. It was her autobiography, written for adults, in her own voice. Raw, unpolished. A first-person account of everything she could recall from her childhood. The moves, the places, the people, the grasshoppers, the hunger, the fear. Freddie. All of it, set down on paper for the first time, 60 years after it happened. Pioneer Girl was never published in Laura's lifetime, not because it was bad, because it was too honest, too stark. Too adult for the market her daughter Rose Wilder Lane was helping her navigate. The manuscript would sit in archives for 84 years before the South Dakota Historical Society Press finally published it in 2014, edited and annotated by Pamela Smith Hill. But Pioneer Girl was the seed, the raw material, the ore from which something else would be extracted, something that would reach millions of readers and shape how an entire nation understood the frontier, the prairie, and the woman who held a family together when the sky turned black with insects. Rose Wilder Lane was, depending on whom you ask, the most important literary collaborator her mother ever had, or the most complicated one. She was born in 1886 in De Smet, the only surviving child of Laura and Almanzo Wilder. By the time her mother started writing Pioneer Girl, Rose was already an established journalist and author in her own right. She had travelled the world. She had written novels and magazine pieces. She understood the publishing industry in ways that Laura, who had spent decades writing columns for a Missouri farming newspaper, did not. Rose looked at Pioneer Girl and saw potential, but not in its current form. The raw memoir was too bleak for children, too fragmented for a novel, too unpolished for New York publishers. What Rose saw was a series, a set of books, each one covering a specific period of Laura's childhood, rewritten in the third person from a child's perspective. Stories that could be sold to Harper and Brothers as children's literature. Stories that would find a massive audience in Depression-era America, where people were hungry for tales of hardship overcome, of families that endured, of a past that felt more honest and more sturdy than the crumbling present. The extent of Rose's contribution has been debated for decades. Was she an editor, a collaborator, a ghostwriter? The truth, as most scholars now agree, lies somewhere in the complicated middle. Rose significantly edited the manuscripts. She restructured narratives. She sharpened prose. She may have rewritten entire passages. But the memories were Laura's. The experiences were Laura's. The emotional core, the specific details of the grasshoppers and the dugout and Ma's face and Pa's fiddle, all of that came from the woman who had lived it. What Rose also brought was ideology. By the 1930s and 1940s, she had become a committed libertarian, one of the founding voices of the American libertarian movement. Her politics emphasized individual self-reliance, suspicion of government, and the mythology of the self-made American family. These ideas seeped into the Little House books in ways that are difficult to measure, precisely, but impossible to ignore. The books emphasize what the Ingalls family did for themselves. They downplay the charity they received, the government relief that kept frontier communities from starving, the structural failures that made frontier life so precarious. Carolyn Fraser, in her Pulitzer Prize finalist biography Prairie Fires, called the Little House series a profound act of American myth-making and self-transformation. Fraser argued that Laura, with Rose's help, had taken a life defined by poverty, failure, loss, and constant movement, and reimagined it as an epic of resilience and pioneer spirit. The disappointment was transformed into parable. The suffering was recast as character building. The story became not what happened, but what it meant. On the Banks of Plum Creek was published by Harper and Brothers in 1937. It was the fourth book in the series. Laura was 70 years old. The events she was describing had happened 63 years earlier, and the book she produced would become the primary document through which the grasshopper plague of 1874 entered American cultural memory. Here is what Laura kept, and here is what she changed. She kept the grasshoppers. The swarm that descends on the family's wheat field in On the Banks of Plum Creek is one of the most vivid passages in American children's literature. The darkening sky, the sound like a roar, the insects covering the ground, eating the crops, or eating the garden, eating everything. Laura's sensory descriptions, written 6 decades after the fact, are so precise and so visceral that historians have used them as primary source material. The physical reality of the plague, as Laura recorded it, is fundamentally accurate. She kept the dugout. The family's home on Plum Creek carved into the bank of the creek, damp and dark and primitive. She kept the wheat field and the hope that the harvest would pay off their debts. She kept Pa's departure to find work and the family's isolation while he was gone. She kept the school and the church and the community of Walnut Grove, populated with characters based on real people, some of them thinly fictionalized. She kept Ma. The Caroline Ingalls of On the Banks of Plum Creek is calm, competent, morally certain, yet all emotionally steady. She is the fixed point around which the family revolves. When the grasshoppers come, Ma does not panic. When Pa leaves, Ma does not collapse. When the food runs low, Ma manages. She is, in Laura's telling, the woman who holds everything together through sheer force of domestic will, and this is where we have to stop and ask the question that sits at the heart of this entire story. Is that true? Was the real Caroline Ingalls as unshakable as the literary Ma? Did she really never break down, never rage at her husband for dragging her to another failed homestead, never weep with exhaustion and grief and the unbearable weight of keeping 4 children alive on nothing? We do not know, and that is the point. We do not know because Caroline left no record. We know only what Laura chose to tell us. And what Laura chose to tell us was a version of her mother that was shaped by love, by memory, by the conventions of 1930s children's literature, and by the ideology of self-reliance that Rose Wilder Lane wove through every page. Feminist historians, including Fraser, have argued that the celebration of Ma's stoic endurance can function to normalise suffering. If Ma never breaks, then breaking is a personal failure, not a consequence of impossible conditions. If Ma manages on nothing, then the absence of government aid is not a crisis, but a test of character. The literary Ma becomes not just a portrait of a real woman, but an argument about what women should be able to endure. The historical Caroline probably did endure with remarkable strength. Everything we know about frontier women suggests that the ones who survived were extraordinarily tough, resourceful, and determined. But she was also human. She was also grieving. She was also exhausted and hungry and frightened, and living through something that no amount of competence could fully manage. The literary version captures the strength. What it smooths away is the cost. And then there is Freddie. The most striking act of editorial surgery in the entire Little House series is the complete erasure of Charles Frederick Ingalls. In the published books, he does not exist. He is not born. He does not die. The family goes from 3 daughters to 4 with Grace's arrival, and the 9-month life of a baby boy in the middle of a catastrophe is simply removed from the record. Laura's original Pioneer Girl manuscript does mention Freddie, though briefly. The details are sparse: a birth, a death, a family moving on. It was in the transformation from raw memoir to published novel that Freddie disappeared. Whether that decision was Laura's or Rose's or a mutual choice, or an editorial suggestion from Harper and Brothers, we do not know for certain. What we know is the result. An entire human life, and a mother's grief over that life, excised from the story that would define the family for generations. Why? Scholars have offered several explanations. The books were written for children, and infant death may have been considered too dark for the audience. The narrative was told from Laura's child perspective, and she may not have fully understood or processed Freddie's death at the time. Rose may have judged the episode too depressing for a series built on resilience and forward motion. Or perhaps the grief was simply too private. Perhaps Caroline's pain over her lost son was something Laura could not bring herself to put on a page that millions of children would read. Whatever the reason, the omission is itself a historical document. It tells us what the 1930s considered appropriate for children to know about frontier life. It tells us what Laura and Rose considered essential to the story and what they deemed expendable. And it tells us more than anything that the relationship between history and literature is never simple. Every story is also a silence. Everything you choose to tell is also a choice about what to leave out. On the Banks of Plum Creek received a Newbery Honour in 1938, 1 year after publication. It became a cornerstone of American children's literature, taught in schools, shelved in libraries, read aloud to children at bedtime for nearly a century. The Grasshopper chapters, specifically, became the most widely known account of the 1870s locust plague. Not the scientific reports, not the newspaper archives, not the government documents. A children's novel, written by a 70-year-old woman remembering what she had seen as a 7-year-old girl. That is the document that preserved the plague in American memory. There is something both beautiful and deeply strange about this. An event that affected 2 million square miles, that involved an estimated 3.5 trillion insects, that bankrupted thousands of families and drove a governor to his knees in prayer. The primary cultural record of that event is a book for children, written from the perspective of a child, filtered through 60 years of memory, shaped by a mother-daughter collaboration, softened for a young audience, and infused with an ideology of self-reliance that would have baffled the actual settlers who survived on charity and mutual aid and the grace of neighbours. And yet, the book works. It works because the emotional truth is real, even when the specific details are reconstructed. Laura may not have remembered the exact words Ma said on the day the grasshoppers arrived, but she remembered the feeling. She remembered the terror and the darkness and the sound and the smell. She remembered what it felt like to be a child watching her world be eaten alive. And she remembered what it felt like to have a mother who refused to let that world end. That is what literature does when archives fail. It preserves the feeling. It keeps the emotional record alive when the documents have crumbled, and the census data has gone cold, and the eyewitness accounts have faded into footnotes. Laura Ingalls Wilder could not give us the exact temperature on the day the swarm arrived. She could not give us the precise bushels of wheat destroyed. She could not give us the account ledgers, or the government reports, or the scientific measurements. She gave us something else. She gave us a 7-year-old girl standing in a doorway watching the sky go dark. She gave us a mother counting flour. She gave us a father walking away because there was no other choice. She gave us the sound of 1,000,000,000,000 wings. And that was enough. That was more than enough. Because 90 years later, we are still talking about it. We are still telling this story. Not because of the entomologists or the census takers or the state legislators, because of a woman who remembered her mother. A woman who sat down during another economic collapse and wrote, from memory, the story of how her family survived the last one. Laura Ingalls. Wilder died on February 10th, 1957, at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri. She was 90 years old. She had outlived her mother by 33 years. She had outlived the grasshoppers by more than half a century. She had outlived every person who had stood on the banks of Plum Creek and watched the wheat disappear. But she had made sure that nobody would ever forget what it felt like. Not the facts, the feeling. The feeling of her mother's hands counting flour in the dark. The feeling of a prairie that could turn against you without warning. The feeling of surviving something that should have destroyed you and carrying that survival inside you for the rest of your life. Like a stone in your chest that is too heavy to put down and too much a part of you to let go. Caroline never wrote her own story. Laura wrote it for her. And in doing so, she gave her mother something that the grasshoppers could never eat, that the prairie could never burn, that time could never erase. She gave her a voice. A voice, once given, does not stay where you put it. Laura Ingalls Wilder gave her mother a voice in 1937, and for decades that voice said exactly what Laura intended it to say. Ma Ingalls was calm. Ma Ingalls was capable. Ma Ingalls was the fixed centre of a family that bent but never broke. Generations of American children grew up with that image, and it became as much a part of the national mythology as the flag on the schoolhouse or the wheat waving in the field. The Ingalls family in the cultural imagination became proof that America worked, that if you were brave enough and good enough and hard-working enough, you could endure anything, even a sky full of locusts, even a husband who walked away to find work 300 miles east, even a baby buried in the ground that nobody in the published books would ever mention. For 50 years after Laura's death in 1957, that was the story. Clean, inspiring, safe for children, safe for a nation that wanted to believe its founding mythology. And then the scholars arrived. It started quietly, just the way these things do. Feminist historians in the 1980s began asking different questions about the frontier. Not, how did settlers conquer the West? But who actually did the work of keeping families alive while men were out conquering? The answer, over and over, was women. Women who rationed flour. Women who preserved meat. Women who delivered babies in sod houses and buried children in unmarked graves and kept households functioning through drought and blizzard and plague with no safety net, no government program, no acknowledgement that what they were doing constituted crisis management of the highest order. Caroline Ingalls became a case study, not the literary Ma, polished smooth by Laura and Rose, the historical Caroline, the one who left no diary, the one whose inner life had to be reconstructed from census records and family letters and the carefully edited memories of a daughter who loved her. Historians like John Mack Farragher and Glenda Riley began writing about what they called frontier domesticity, the specific constellation of labour and aspiration and identity that women like Caroline navigated on the prairie. Their work revealed something the Little House books had always hinted at, but never said directly, that Ma's work was not supporting labour, It was the labour. Without it, the family died. Without it, there was no story for Laura to tell. Then, in 2014, the raw material finally surfaced. The South Dakota Historical Society Press published Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography, Laura's original unedited memoir, the one that had sat in archives for 84 years. For the first time, readers could see what Laura had actually written before Rose reshaped it, before Harper and Brothers softened it, before the story became the story America wanted to hear. Pioneer Girl sold out its first printing almost immediately. The demand stunned the publisher. Apparently, people wanted to know what had been left out. What they found was not a scandal. It was something more unsettling than a scandal. It was complexity. The original memoir was darker, more candid, more financially precarious than the published novels. The poverty was sharper, the moves were more desperate. Freddie was there, briefly, a baby born and a baby lost. The community aid that kept settlers alive, the charity and mutual support that the published books downplayed, was more visible in the raw account. The story was not less inspiring. It was differently inspiring. It was the story of survival not through self-reliance alone, but through interdependence, through neighbours and churches and the fragile web of human connection that kept people alive when their crops were eaten and their savings were gone. 3 years after Pioneer Girl was published, Caroline Fraser released Prairie Fires, the American dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder. It won the National Book Critics Circle Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. It was the most comprehensive biography of the Wilder family ever written, and it did something that no previous work had fully accomplished. It held the entire story in one hand, the real history and the literary mythology, the poverty and the parable, the woman who lived it, and the daughter who reimagined it, and the granddaughter collaborator who infused it with an ideology of rugged individualism that the actual Ingalls family, who survived on community support and the grace of neighbours, would barely have recognised. Fraser's biography arrived at a cultural moment when Americans were already rethinking their founding stories. Questions about whose version of history gets told, whose suffering gets romanticised, whose labour gets credited, these were not academic abstractions anymore. They were national conversations, and the Little House books, beloved by millions, sat right at the centre of that reckoning. In June 2018, the Association for Library Service to Children voted 12-0 to strip Laura Ingalls Wilder's name from its prestigious Children's Literature Award. The Laura Ingalls Wilder Award became the Children's Literature Legacy Award. The reason, stated publicly, was that Wilder's books contained dated cultural attitudes toward Indigenous people and people of colour that contradict modern acceptance, celebration, and understanding of diverse communities. The decision ignited a firestorm. Defenders argued that Wilder was a product of her time, that the books were historically valuable precisely because they reflected 19th century attitudes, that erasing her name was an act of presentism. Critics argued that honouring a name is different from reading a book, that an award should reflect current values, that Indigenous children should not have to accept a prize named for an author who described their ancestors as less than human. Neither side was entirely wrong. And that was exactly the point. The clean, simple story that Laura had crafted, the one where good families endured and the frontier rewarded the brave, had always contained silences. The silence about Freddie. The silence about the charity that kept settlers fed. The silence about the Dakota people whose land the Ingalls were homesteading barely a decade after the US-Dakota War of 1862. These silences had been built into the foundation of the story, and now, nearly a century later, they were cracking open. But here is what is remarkable. The story survived the reckoning, not unchanged, not unchallenged, but alive, because the grasshopper plague was real. The dugout on Plum Creek was real. The hunger was real. The father walking 300 miles to find work was real. And the mother standing in that dugout with 3 small children, counting what was left, figuring out how to make it last, that was real too. No amount of scholarly revision could erase what Caroline Ingalls actually did in those years. The debate was never about whether she endured. It was about how we tell the story of her endurance and what we allow that story to mean. And in 2020, a different kind of locust swarm made the parallel impossible to ignore. Between late 2019 and early 2020, billions of desert locusts descended on East Africa. Kenya had not seen a plague of that magnitude in 70 years. Ethiopia and Somalia had not experienced anything comparable in over 3 decades. The swarms threatened the food security of 19 million farmers and pastoralists across the Horn of Africa. The species was different. Leucistus gregaria, the desert locust, not Melanoplus spretus, the Rocky Mountain locust that had plagued Caroline. But the mechanism was hauntingly similar. Unusual weather patterns linked to climate change, specifically warmer ocean temperatures driving cyclones in the Indian Ocean, created the wet conditions that allowed locust populations to explode. The swarms travelled up to 120 kilometres per day. They consumed crops and rangeland with the same indiscriminate ferocity that settlers in 1870s Minnesota had described, and the people who bore the brunt of it were, again, the people with the least. Subsistence farmers, pastoralists, women managing households in rural communities, stretching food supplies, calculating how long the stores would last, doing the arithmetic of survival that Caroline Ingalls had done a century and a half before. The technology had changed, the geography had shifted. But the fundamental equation, a family's food security shattered by an ecological event beyond anyone's control, was identical. The Rocky Mountain locust is gone. It has been gone for more than a century. The IUCN declared it officially extinct in 2014. The same year, Pioneer Girl was finally published. A coincidence that feels almost literary in its symmetry. But the lessons of the locust are not gone. They are, if anything, more relevant now than they were when Laura sat down with her pencil in 1930. The first lesson is ecological. An insect species that once formed the largest animal aggregation in recorded history, 3.5 trillion individuals covering an area larger than California, was driven to extinction in roughly 30 years. The settlers who ploughed up the river valleys and wetlands where the locusts bred during their solitary phase did not know they were committing an act of extinction. They were farming. They were surviving. They were doing exactly what the Homestead Act told them to do. And in doing so, they eliminated a species that had existed for millennia. Jeffrey Lockwood's research, extracting locust bodies from glaciers in Wyoming and Montana, proved that the extinction was not a miracle. It was an ecological consequence of agricultural transformation. The second lesson is about women's labour. Caroline Ingalls managed a household through an environmental catastrophe without resources, without recognition, and without leaving a single written record of her own perspective. She is not unique. She is representative. Across history, across geography, across every disaster that has ever befallen a human community, there have been women doing precisely what Caroline did, stretching resources, managing children, maintaining morale, performing the invisible crisis work that keeps families alive. Feminist historians have given this work a name. They have written about it, analysed it, elevated it, but the work itself has always been there, whether or not anyone noticed it. The third lesson is about storytelling. Every history is also an editorial decision. Laura chose what to include and what to leave out. Rose shaped the narrative to fit an ideology. Harper and Brothers softened it for a market. The ALSC honoured it and then reconsidered. Scholars critiqued it. Readers loved it anyway. And through all of that, the emotional core, a child watching her mother hold a family together against impossible odds, remained true. Not factually perfect, emotionally true. And sometimes that is the only kind of truth that survives. The grasshopper plague of 1874 could have been forgotten. It nearly was. It was not a war. It was not a political crisis. It was not the kind of event that generates monuments and memorial days and presidential speeches. It was an agricultural disaster in a remote corner of a young state, suffered by people who had no political power and left few records. The official archive was thin. The government response was inadequate. The scientific understanding came a century too late. What saved the story was a woman who remembered. and what she remembered was not data. It was her mother's face, the sound of the insects, the darkness at noon, the feeling of being small and frightened and watching someone she loved refuse to be defeated by it. That is not a footnote in agricultural history. That is the story of how human beings survive, and it is worth telling correctly. It is worth telling with the complexity restored, with the silences acknowledged, with the real woman standing where the literary character used to be, imperfect and exhausted and grieving, and still somehow counting the flower. There is a cemetery in De Smet, South Dakota. It was platted like a town, because that is what people did on the prairie. They organised even their dead into blocks and lots, the way they organised their living, as if order itself could hold back the chaos of a landscape that had never promised them anything. Block by block, lot by lot. 4 by 8 feet per grave. Paths wide enough for a wagon, later wide enough for a car, a flagpole at the centre, and in one corner a row of headstones that draws more visitors than any other spot in the cemetery. More visitors, probably, than anyone buried there could have imagined. Charles Ingalls, Caroline Ingalls, Mary Ingalls, Carrie Ingalls, Swansea. And one more small marker, almost easy to miss, the infant son of Laura and Almanzo Wilder, who did not live long enough to be given a name in the public record. Grace Ingalls Dow and her husband Nate are buried nearby, in the same cemetery but a different spot, as if even in death the family maintained its pattern of being almost together but never quite settled in one place. Laura is not there, she's in Mansfield, Missouri, and buried beside Almanzo on the farm where she sat down with a pencil and rewrote her mother's life for the world. The only member of the family who left the prairie for good, the only one who turned the leaving into something permanent. But Caroline is there, in De Smet, in the ground of the place where the family finally stopped moving. The headstone that marks her grave was not placed there when she died in 1924. For decades, only Charles had a marker. It was not until 1958, the year after Laura died, that Rose Wilder Lane paid to have her grandfather's headstone lettering recut, and the newly formed Laura Ingalls Wilder Memorial Society added markers for Caroline, Mary and the baby. Think about that for a moment. Caroline Lake Quiner Ingalls kept a family alive through the worst agricultural disaster in American frontier history. She rationed flour in a dugout while the sky rained insects. She buried a son. She scrubbed hotel floors in a town she never wanted to live in. She raised 4 surviving daughters, one of whom would become the most famous children's author in American history. And when she died, at 84, no one put a stone on her grave for 34 years. But here is the part that will keep you up tonight. That silence, that 34-year gap between death and marker, is not the exception. It is the rule. For every Caroline Ingalls whose name was eventually carved into stone, there are tens of thousands of frontier women who were never marked at all. Women who did the same work, who stretched the same flour, who buried the same children, who held the same families together through the same impossible conditions, and whose names we will never know. Because nobody wrote their story. Nobody's daughter sat down with a pencil and remembered. But someone did remember Caroline. And because someone did, we can stand in the 21st century and ask a question that Caroline herself could never have asked, because she was too busy surviving to ask it. What does her story mean now? Not in 1875 when the grasshoppers ate the wheat. Not in 1937 when Laura published the book. Not even in 2014 when Pioneer Girl finally gave us the unedited version. But right now, today, in a world where the parallels are no longer metaphorical, here is something that would have been impossible to explain to Caroline Ingalls, but that she would have understood instantly. Climate scientists at Arizona State University published a study showing that rising global temperatures will increase locust swarm intensity by 8 to 17% per wet season, shortening generation times, fueling population growth and supporting more years with 3 generations per season instead of 2. More swarms, more destruction, more families are watching their food disappear. A separate study projected that between 2065 and 2100, desert locust range could expand by 13 to 25% into new regions of South and Central Asia, as erratic rainfall patterns create the exact conditions: hot, dry stretches followed by sudden heavy rains that trigger swarming. The Rocky Mountain locust is gone. Melanopus spretus will never darken a Minnesota sky again. But the mechanism that created the plague, a collision between human agricultural ambition and ecological forces beyond anyone's control, that mechanism is not gone. It is accelerating. And the people who will bear the greatest burden of that acceleration are, again, the people who always bear the greatest burden. The women managing households in rural communities, the mothers stretching food supplies, the people doing the invisible arithmetic of survival that Caroline Ingalls did in a dugout on Plum Creek 150 years ago. The technology has changed. The geography has shifted. The species is different. But the equation is the same. And if you think that equation has nothing to do with you, consider this. The United States lost over $10 billion in crop damage from climate-related disasters in a single year recently. The Midwest, the same region where Caroline counted flour, is projected to see increasing volatility in growing seasons. The lineage from Plum Creek to the present is not a metaphor, it is a direct line. There is one more thing we need to talk about before this story ends, and it is the thing that has been underneath everything from the first chapter to this one, running like groundwater beneath the prairie. It is about who gets to tell the story. Caroline did not tell her own story. She left no diary, no memoir, no letters that survived. The most consequential woman in the most famous family narrative in American frontier literature is known to us entirely through someone else's memory. Laura told the story, but she told it 60 years later, filtered through the conventions of 1930s children's literature and shaped by Rose Wilder Lane's editorial hand and libertarian ideology. The version Laura told was true in its emotions, but selective in its facts. Freddie was erased, the charity was minimised, the community support that actually kept settlers alive was replaced with a narrative of self-reliance that the historical record does not fully support. Rose shaped the story further, not out of malice, but out of conviction. She believed in the mythology of the self-made American family, and she built that mythology into the bones of the books. Harper and Brothers published the story for a market that wanted inspiration during the Depression, not complexity. Generations of teachers assigned the story to children who absorbed the mythology without the footnotes, and then, decades later, scholars began to pull back the layers. Feminist historians, environmental historians, literary critics, indigenous scholars who pointed out that the Ingalls family's beloved homestead sat on Dakota land, taken by force barely a decade before the grasshoppers arrived. In 2018, the Association for Library Service to Children voted to remove Laura Ingalls Wilder's name from its award, not because the books were worthless, because the stories contained silences that could no longer be ignored. And that decision, controversial as it was, actually honoured the deepest lesson of Caroline's story, because Caroline's life was about silences. The silence of a woman who did essential work without recognition, the silence of a grief that was too private to publish, the silence of a gravestone that took 34 years to appear. The whole story, from the dugout to the cemetery, is a story about what happens when the people who hold everything together are the last ones anyone thinks to remember. But here is what nobody expected, and this is the part that changes everything. The story refused to stay silent. Pioneer Girl was published in 2014 and sold out immediately. Carolyn Fraser's Prairie Fires won the National Book Critics Circle Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer. The Laura Ingalls Wilder Museum in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, still draws visitors from around the world to a town of fewer than 900 people. To see the place where a dugout once stood beside a creek, where a family once tried to grow wheat in soil that was already full of locust eggs. People keep coming. They keep reading. They keep asking the questions that Caroline never got to answer for herself. What did it feel like? What did it cost? Was she angry? Was she afraid? Did she ever, in the quiet of that dugout with the children asleep and the flour almost gone and the insects still clicking in the fields outside, did she ever wonder what her life would have looked like if she had said no? If she had refused to pack the wagon one more time? If she had told Charles that she was done? We do not know. We will never know. That is the silence at the centre of the story, and no amount of scholarship or literary analysis will ever fill it. But we know something else. We know that she stayed. We know that she counted the flour. We know that she kept the children fed and the household running and the family intact through conditions that would have justified any amount of rage or collapse or surrender. We know that she did this without recognition, without a diary, without a gravestone for 34 years, without ever once being asked by anyone on the historical record what she thought about any of it. And we know that her daughter remembered. Not perfectly, not completely, not without ideology and editorial compromise and the inevitable distortions of 6 decades of memory. But Laura remembered the feeling, the darkness of the swarm, the sound of 1,000,000,000,000 wings, the sight of her mother's hands in the dim light of the dugout measuring what was left, calculating what could be stretched, deciding what would be enough. This story began with a sky going dark over Minnesota in the summer of 1873. Billions of insects, the largest animal aggregation ever recorded, descending on a landscape that human beings had only just begun to reshape in their own image. It was an event of almost incomprehensible scale. 2 million square miles, 5 years of recurring devastation, an entire species that appeared, destroyed, and then vanished so completely that a scientist had to dig its body out of a glacier a century later to prove it had ever existed. But the story was never really about the insects. It was about a woman standing in a doorway, a woman who had been born in Brookfield, Wisconsin, in 1839, who had married a restless carpenter named Charles when she was 20, who had followed him from state to state and territory to territory, because that is what wives did, and because some part of her, despite everything, still believed that the next place might be the right one. It was about what she did when the next place turned out to be the wrong one again, when the wheat was eaten, when the baby was buried, when the husband walked east and the flour ran low, and the children looked to her for an answer she did not have. She counted the flour. That is not a grand gesture. It is not the kind of thing that gets carved on monuments or taught in history classes or celebrated in national mythology. It is a woman in a dark room, doing math, measuring what remains, dividing it by the number of people who need to eat, subtracting the days until something changes or nothing does. It is the most ordinary act of survival imaginable, and it is the most radical, because every crisis in human history has been survived this way, not by the people who made the speeches or signed the proclamations or declared the days of prayer, by the people who counted the flour, by the people who looked at what was left and figured out how to make it last one more day, by the people who did this work without recognition, without record, without anyone ever asking them how it felt or what it cost or whether they were afraid. Caroline Ingalls did not write her own story. She did not need to. She was the story. Every act of quiet, unrecognised, essential labour that has ever kept a family alive in the face of forces beyond its control, that is Caroline's story. Every mother who has ever stretched a paycheck or rationed a meal or held a household together through a crisis that the history books will never mention, that is Caroline standing in the dugout, counting the flour. Laura gave her a voice. Scholars gave her complexity. Time gave her relevance. But what Caroline gave herself, what she earned in those years on Plum Creek with the insects in the fields, and the baby in the ground, and the husband somewhere east, and the flour almost gone, was something no one else could give her and no one could take away. She gave herself one more day, and then another, and then another, until the grasshoppers were gone, and the family was still standing and the story could be told. The grasshoppers are extinct now. The dugout is gone. The wheat field has been other things for over a century. But the story is still here, still being told, still being heard by the daughters and granddaughters and great-great-granddaughters of women who counted flour in their own dark rooms during their own impossible seasons, with their own children looking to them for answers they did not have. Caroline never knew any of this would happen. She never knew that her daughter would write a book, that the book would be read by millions, that scholars would argue about what was real and what was invented. that her name would be carved into a headstone in De Smet, South Dakota, 34 years after she died, that people would still be talking about her right now, in this moment, more than 150 years after she stood in that doorway and watched the sky go dark. She did not know any of that. She only knew the flower. She only knew the children. She only knew that tomorrow was coming whether she was ready for it or not, and that someone had to count what was left. She counted it, and that was enough. Perfect. Now I have all the information needed. Let me create Chapter 7 that seamlessly continues from Chapter 6 and leads into the dark secrets Laura hid. She counted it, and that was enough. Except it was not enough. Not really. Not if we are being honest about what Caroline Ingalls lived through and what her daughter chose to bury in silence. Because in January of 2025, Netflix announced something that would have been impossible to explain to Caroline, impossible even to explain to Laura when she sat down in 1930 with her pencil and her memories. A streaming service that delivers stories directly into homes across the world announced that it would be telling the Ingalls family story again, a new adaptation, a fresh retelling for a generation that has never known a world without smartphones or satellite internet or the ability to see into anyone's life at any moment. The announcement came with all the carefully chosen words that entertainment companies use when they are selling hope. Part hopeful family drama, part epic survival tale, and part origin story of the American West. Rebecca Sonnenschein, the showrunner who had worked on The Boys and the Vampire Diaries, told Variety that she fell deeply in love with Laura's books as a child. Production began in June of 2025 in Canada. The premiere is scheduled for 2026, and across social media, across fan forums and comment sections and the endless scroll of modern conversation, the same questions kept surfacing. Questions that Caroline would have understood better than anyone. What will they show? And more importantly, what will they hide? Because here is what you need to understand about the Little House story that has been passed down through books and television, and now, apparently, through streaming platforms that did not exist a decade ago. Every version of this story has been an act of selective memory. Every retelling has been a negotiation between what actually happened and what the audience can bear to witness. Laura made choices about what to include and what to erase. We have talked about Freddie. We have talked about the charity and the community aid and the uncomfortable truth that the family did not survive through self-reliance alone. But there are other silences in the Little House books, deeper ones, darker ones, the kind that do not fit into children's literature or family television, or the mythology of pioneer resilience that America has been telling itself for over a century. And the question hanging over the Netflix adaptation is the same question that has hung over every version of this story since Laura first sat down to write it. How much truth can the audience handle? Let me tell you what happened in Burr Oak, Iowa, that Laura never put into the published books. You already know that the family spent a year and a half there after fleeing Minnesota. You know that they lived in one room in the Masters Hotel. Yeah, that Caroline cooked for guests and scrubbed floors and did work that was beneath the dignity of the life she had been promised when she married Charles Ingalls. You know that Laura omitted the entire Burr Oak period from the Little House series, creating what scholars call the missing link in the narrative. What you do not know, what was not revealed until Pioneer Girl was finally published in 2014, is what Caroline witnessed during those 18 months. What she heard through the thin walls of that hotel. What she could not stop even though she was standing right there. What she carried with her for the rest of her life, and never, not once, wrote down in any document that survived. There was a man at the hotel. His name was Mr. Cameron. He was a drunk. Not the charming, harmless drunk of television comedy, the violent kind. The kind who spent most of his time in the saloon and came home with rage in his blood and a need to hurt something smaller than himself. He lived with his wife in the rooms below the Ingalls family. One night, Caroline was putting her daughters to bed when the screaming started. Not the kind of scream that comes from surprise or pain that will heal. The kind that comes from someone who knows they are about to die and cannot stop it from happening. Charles went downstairs. This is what he found. Mr. Cameron was dragging his wife across the floor by her long hair, gripping it in one fist while she screamed and tried to crawl away from him. In his other hand, he was holding a kerosene lamp, upside down. The fuel was pouring out onto his hand, catching fire, flaming up around his fingers. He was so drunk, so consumed by his need to hurt his wife, that he did not even notice his own hand was burning. Charles stopped him. Charles, who played the fiddle and built things and chased horizons with reckless optimism, had to walk into a room where a man was burning alive while dragging his terrified wife across the floor, had to physically intervene, had to make it stop. And upstairs, Caroline held her daughters and listened to the screaming and knew that there was a wall, just a wall, between her children and a kind of violence that should not exist in the same world where anyone talks about pioneer spirit or resilience or the nobility of frontier life. That is not in the Little House books. Laura was 9 years old when it happened. She heard the screaming. She saw her father go downstairs. She knew what violence sounded like through the floor of a hotel where her family was living because they had nowhere else to go. She never wrote about it. Not for children. Not in a way that would make it onto bookshelves in schools and libraries. Not in a way that would become part of the national mythology. But it happened, and Caroline was there, and the question you should be asking right now, the question that should keep you awake tonight, is this. What else happened that was never written down? There was another incident in Burr Oak, another story that Laura mentioned in Pioneer Girl and then never touched again. A man and his wife ran a shop in town. The wife tried to leave him. We do not know why. Pioneer Girl does not give us the details, but we know what happened when he found out she was planning to go. He beat her so badly that the entire town knew about it. Laura, 9 years old, heard the adults talking about it, heard the words they used, saw the shopkeeper's wife afterward, or did not see her because women who are beaten badly enough stop appearing in public spaces for a while, and Caroline standing in that hotel kitchen cooking for strangers, managing 3 daughters and an infant son who would be dead within months. Caroline knew. She knew that violence was not rare. She knew that the frontier was not just grasshoppers and drought and crop failure. She knew that for women, the danger was not just the land. It was the men who brought you there. She never said this in any letter that survived. Never testified to it in any document. Never stood up in any public forum and said what she must have known in her bones. That pioneer life for women was not an adventure. It was a trap. You moved where your husband decided to move. You lived where he decided to live. You survived on the money he earned or did not earn. And if he was violent, if he was cruel, if he made decisions that endangered your children, you had almost no recourse, no shelters, no hotlines, no legal protection worth the paper it was printed on. Just the thin hope that your husband was a decent man and the terrible knowledge that many women's husbands were not. Charles Ingalls was not abusive. By all accounts, he loved his family. He played the fiddle and told stories and never raised his hand to his wife or his daughters in any way that made it into any historical record. But Caroline lived in a world where other men did, where the walls were thin and the screaming came through at night and there was nothing, absolutely nothing she could do to make it stop. Do you think the Netflix adaptation will show that? Do you think they will give us a scene where 9-year-old Laura hears a woman being dragged across the floor by her hair while a drunk man's hand burns with kerosene? Do you think they will let the audience sit with the knowledge that Caroline Ingalls, the woman we have spent 6 chapters celebrating for her strength and her endurance and her quiet competence, was also a woman who had to listen to domestic violence through the floor and could not save anyone? Or do you think they will do what Laura did? What the 1970s television show did? What every adaptation has done since the books were first published? Sand down the edges, soften the violence, turn the story back into something that audiences can digest without choking on it. But let me tell you the part that will haunt you more than the violence. The Ingalls family left Burr Oak in the middle of the night. They packed their wagon quietly in the dark, while the town slept. And they left with debts unpaid. Pioneer Girl does not sugarcoat this. Laura, writing 60 years later, remembered that they sold the cow to get enough money to leave, that they owed money to merchants in town, that they could not pay it, that they left anyway under cover of darkness, the way people leave when they are fleeing something or someone, or just the crushing weight of a life that has gone wrong in too many ways to count. This is not the story America tells about pioneer families. Then this is not the story of people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, working hard, earning their success through grit and determination. This is the story of people so poor, so desperate, so broken by the relentless failure of everything they tried, that they ran, they fled, they abandoned their obligations because there was no other choice, and Caroline packed that wagon in the dark. Caroline, who wanted nothing more than a stable home and a permanent address, and the kind of life where you did not have to sneak away from your debts like a thief. Caroline loaded Mary and Laura and Carrie and baby Freddie, who had only 4 months left to live, though she did not know that yet. And she left Burr Oak, Iowa, in the middle of the night. Did she cry while she packed? Did she rage at Charles for bringing her there for promising her things he could never deliver, for chasing opportunity after opportunity that always turned to ash? Did she look at her daughters, sleeping in the wagon, and wonder what kind of life she was giving them? What kind of example she was setting? Or did she just do what she always did? Count what was left, calculate what could be carried, make the impossible possible for one more day, one more night, one more flight into the dark. We do not know. She left no record, and her daughter, when she finally wrote about that time, wrote only the barest facts. They left Burr Oak. They did not pay their debts. They moved on. No explanation, no emotion, no indication of what it cost Caroline to become the kind of person who runs from her obligations because staying would cost even more. That silence is its own kind of testimony. The Netflix adaptation will premiere in 2026. It will star actors whose names Caroline would not recognise, telling a story she lived but did not write. It will be filmed in Canada, standing in for Minnesota and Wisconsin and Iowa, and all the other places where Caroline packed and packed again. And it will make choices. Every adaptation makes choices about what to show and what to hide, about how much darkness an audience can handle, about whether the point of the story is historical truth or emotional uplift or something in between. Rebecca Sonnenschein, the showrunner, said in interviews that this adaptation will go back to the books rather than rehashing the 1970s television show, that it will be part hopeful family drama, part epic survival tale, and part origin story of the American West. Hopeful. That word is doing a lot of work, because the true story of the Ingalls family, the one Laura tried to tell in Pioneer Girl before it was reshaped into something more palatable, is not hopeful. It is relentless. It is about people who kept moving because staying would mean admitting they had failed. It is about a woman who rationed flour and buried a baby and listened to violence through thin walls and could not make any of it stop. It is about survival, yes. But survival is not always hopeful. Sometimes survival is just the thing you do because the alternative is dying, and there is nothing romantic about that, nothing inspiring, nothing that fits neatly into a mythology about America and pioneers and the frontier spirit. So the question hanging over this new adaptation, the question that has hung over every retelling of this story, is the same question Laura faced when she sat down to write. Do you tell the truth? Or do you tell the story people need to hear? And which version does Caroline deserve? Here is what will not make it into the Netflix show. I can say this with certainty, not because I have read the scripts, but because I understand how stories work in a culture that has decided some truths are too ugly to be profitable. They will not show you the full extent of the poverty, not the kind where you flee in the night with unpaid debts, not the kind where a mother has to choose between feeding her children and buying medicine for a baby who is going to die anyway, not the kind where grown adults argue about money with a ferocity that terrifies the children listening through thin walls. They will not show you the domestic violence that Caroline witnessed. Not the burning hand and the screaming woman, not the shopkeeper's wife beaten so badly the town gossips about it for weeks, not the reality that for women on the frontier, violence was not an aberration. It was a constant background hum, something you learned to live with because you had no other choice. They will not show you the moment when Caroline realised that her husband was never going to give her the life he promised, that the next place was always going to be the wrong place, that she would spend her entire life packing and unpacking and packing again because Charles Ingalls could not stay still long enough to build the home she needed, They will not show you the rage, because Caroline must have been angry. She must have been. You cannot live through what she lived through without rage, without looking at your husband, the man you married when you were 20 years old and gave up your teaching income for, and feeling something sharp and bitter and close to hatred. But there is no record of that rage. No letter where Caroline tells her sister or her mother, or anyone at all, that she is angry, that she is tired, that she wants it to stop, that she married the wrong man and chose the wrong life and is trapped now, completely trapped, because leaving would mean abandoning her daughters or taking them into an even more uncertain future. So either Caroline never felt that rage, which is impossible, or she felt it and never wrote it down, never spoke it aloud in any place where it might be recorded, kept it buried so deep that even her daughter, who loved her enough to write books about her, never saw it clearly enough to put it on the page. That is the silence at the centre of this story, not just what happened, but what Caroline felt about what happened, and whether she ever, even once, allowed herself to admit that the life she was living was not the one she deserved. Netflix will give us a Caroline Ingalls. An actress will play her. We'll stand in doorways and count flour and hold children and do all the things the real Caroline did. And maybe, if the writing is good and the performance is honest, we will see something of the real woman, some hint of the cost, some shadow of the anger she carried, but we will not see all of it. Because all of it is too much, too dark, too honest about what it actually cost to be a woman on the frontier, too truthful about the fact that pioneer life was not an adventure for women. It was endurance. It was survival. It was making yourself small enough to fit into the space your husband's choices left for you. And that is not the story America wants to watch on Netflix on a Friday night after a long week at work. America wants the flower counting. America wants the quiet strength. America wants to believe that if Caroline could survive the grasshoppers and the poverty and the baby's death and the endless, relentless moving, then maybe we can survive whatever we are going through right now. And that's a fair thing to want. That is perhaps what stories are for. To show us that survival is possible, that people before us endured worse and came through and left something behind worth remembering. But in the process of making the story bearable, we lose something. We lose the truth of what it actually took. The rage and the grief and the moments when Caroline must have stood in that dugout with the flower almost gone and the baby crying and the husband hundreds of miles away and thought, just for a moment, about walking into Plum Creek and not coming back. We lose that. We have to lose that. Because if we kept it, the story would not be inspiring anymore. It would just be sad. And Laura knew this. When she wrote on the banks of Plum Creek, when she left Freddie out and smoothed away the Burr Oak violence and turned her mother into Ma, the calm and capable centre of the family, Laura knew she was trading truth for something else, for readability, for publication, for the chance to make her mother's life mean something beyond the suffering. It was a trade worth making. The books exist. The story survives. Caroline Ingalls is remembered when tens of thousands of other frontier women have been forgotten. But it was still a trade. And what was lost in that trade was the full, complicated, sometimes ugly truth of what it cost to be the woman who counted the flower. So here we are, in 2026, give or take, waiting for Netflix to show us another version of a story that has been told so many times it has worn grooves into the American imagination. Another Caroline, another Ma, another woman standing in another doorway, measuring what is left. And you, reading this now, have a choice to make. You can watch the Netflix version and let it comfort you. Let it tell you that if Caroline could survive, so can you. Let it be the hopeful family drama the showrunner promised. The story that ends with the family still standing and the love still intact and the promise that hard work and determination are enough. Or you can hold both truths at once. You can know that the story you're watching is a carefully edited version of something far messier and more painful and more human than what makes it onto the screen. You can remember that behind every Ma Ingalls, calm and capable and perfectly composed, there was a Caroline Ingalls who was none of those things, who was angry and exhausted and trapped and still got up every morning and counted the flower because someone had to. You can remember that survival is not always beautiful, that endurance is not always inspiring, that sometimes people hold on not because they are strong, but because letting go would mean admitting that all of it. See, every move and every loss and every year of hoping the next place would be different was for nothing. And you can ask yourself the question that has been underneath this entire documentary, from the first chapter to this one. What do we owe the women who held everything together? Do we owe them the truth, even when the truth is ugly? Even when it makes us uncomfortable? Even when it forces us to admit that the mythology we've been telling about pioneers in the American West and self-reliance is, at best, incomplete, and at worst, a lie? Or do we owe them the story that makes their suffering mean something? The version where the flower counting worked, where the family survived, where Caroline's relentless, invisible, unrecognised labour was enough to keep everyone alive, and the ending, if not happy, was at least bearable. I cannot answer that for you. Laura could not answer it either. She gave us both versions, the raw memoir that sat in archives for 84 years, and the children's books that became classics, the truth and the myth, the rage and the resignation, the woman who fled Burr Oak in the dark with unpaid debts, and the Ma who never complained. Both women are real, both stories are true, and in 2026 Netflix will give us another version, and we will watch it or not watch it, and Caroline will remain where she has always been. In the ground in De Smet, South Dakota, under a headstone that took 34 years to place, remembered and forgotten, celebrated and erased, the woman who counted the flower. But before you close this page, before you move on to whatever comes next in your endless scroll through other people's stories, let me leave you with one more thing, one more secret Laura hid, one more truth that Netflix will not show you, one more piece of the story that changes everything you thought you knew about the woman who held the Ingalls family together, because we are not done yet. Not quite. There is one more chapter, one more revelation, one more moment when the carefully constructed story cracks open and you see what was always underneath. And when you see it, you will understand why Laura made the choices she made, why some truths stay buried, and why the woman who counted the flower deserves better than any version of this story has ever given her. That is next. And it is the part that will stay with you long after Netflix fades into whatever comes after Netflix. Long after the books are out of print and the museums close and the tourists stop visiting the dugout site on Plum Creek. Because some stories refuse to stay silent, some women refuse to be forgotten, and some truths, no matter how carefully buried, find their way back to the surface. Caroline is still counting, and we are still listening.